Right now, a small group of Wall Street private equity firms and tech billionaires are quietly buying up the very dirt beneath our feet. For generations, America's heartland belonged to family farmers. But a massive, silent migration of institutional capital has completely inverted the system. Millions of acres of prime agricultural land across Iowa and Nebraska are being systematically vacuumed up by faceless corporations. Why are the wealthiest people on Earth suddenly obsessed with dirt? Because they realize a terrifying truth. Whoever owns the soil controls the food on your plate. The invisible invasion. Over the past decade, a profound and unprecedented realignment has occurred within the global financial landscape. High net worth individuals and massive institutional asset managers have embarked on a quiet campaign to accumulate one of the most critical, non-reproducible assets on the planet, American topsoil. Technology icons, most notably Bill Gates, have systematically pivoted away from traditional equities and volatile tech markets to become the preeminent private owners of agricultural land in the United States. Today, his portfolio spans over 275,000 acres of highly productive land across multiple states. This billionaire pivot is not merely a personal investment trend. It reflects a broader, structural movement across the upper echelons of global capital. The scale of institutional firepower entering this sector is staggering. Traditional asset management giants are aggressively scaling up their agricultural footprints through high-stakes acquisitions and capital deployment. A prime example of this institutional consolidation is WisdomTree's acquisition of Ceres Partners for $275 million, a transaction that signals the formal financialization of agricultural real estate on an enterprise level. Simultaneously, private equity firms are systematically buying out digital crowdfunding platforms like AcreTrader. By absorbing these platforms, Wall Street has established direct, friction-free pipelines into local rural land registries, allowing institutional capital to bypass traditional local real estate brokers and rapidly acquire acreage across the Midwest. From a macroeconomic perspective, Wall Street views American topsoil as the ultimate inflation hedge. Farmland represents an exceptionally scarce asset class characterized by an inelastic demand curve, because while the global population expands, the total supply of arable land actively decreases. Historically, agricultural real estate has demonstrated a remarkable ability to outpace inflation, consistently delivering annualized value increases of approximately 6% over the last half-decade. Furthermore, these properties provide guaranteed, recurring lease yields. By utilizing triple net lease structures, institutional owners shift all operational liabilities, including property taxes, insurance, and fluctuating input costs, directly onto the tenant farmer, securing a highly predictable, risk-mitigated cash flow for corporate shareholders. The ghost buyers, how the monopoly hides in plain sight. This massive consolidation of domestic territory remains largely invisible to the average consumer due to a sophisticated, multi-tiered corporate architecture designed specifically to mask institutional footprints. Private equity conglomerates and corporate land barons rarely execute purchases under their flagship corporate names. Instead, they deploy an intricate shield of thousands of hyper-localized, generic limited liability companies, LLCs, and blind trusts. A single institutional fund might acquire contiguous tracts of land across Iowa or Nebraska using dozens of distinct shell identities with ambiguous names like Oak River Holdings or Platte Valley Land Trust. This deliberate obscurity ensures that local farming communities, neighboring operators, and even county officials remain completely unaware that their local agricultural borders are being systematically absorbed by a single multi-billion-dollar corporate entity. The proliferation of these ghost buyers is actively exacerbated by systemic failures within federal monitoring frameworks. The primary mechanism tasked with tracking large-scale agricultural land transfers is the Agricultural Foreign Investment Disclosure Act, or AFIDA, passed in 1978. However, this regulatory architecture is fundamentally obsolete. It relies heavily on voluntary, self-reported disclosures and was originally designed to monitor foreign oligarchs and international sovereign entities, leaving a massive blind spot regarding domestic private equity firms and domestic institutional funds. Even when corporate entities fail to comply with these basic disclosure mandates, the enforcement mechanisms are practically toothless. The statutory penalties for non-compliance or late filings represent negligible administrative fines that corporate legal departments routinely dismiss as a minor cost of doing business. Consequently, billions of dollars in domestic corporate land accumulation slip entirely under the public radar. The structural lack of transparency obscures a broader, deeply calculated consolidation of primary American infrastructure. This is not a series of isolated real estate investments or speculative plays. It is a coordinated effort to centralize control over the country's foundational resource nodes. By quietly purchasing the physical territory that underpins the domestic food supply, a handful of centralized corporate boardrooms are dismantling a century-old model of decentralized, community-accountable land ownership and replacing it with an opaque, consolidated oligopoly. The Heartland target. Why Iowa and Nebraska are being strip-mined. While institutional capital is expanding across the nation, a significant portion of this corporate migration is intensely focused on two specific states, Iowa and Nebraska. This targeted focus is driven by the unique geological composition of the region. The deep, glaciated molly-soil topsoil found across the western Corn Belt represents the global crown jewel of agricultural productivity. Enriched by centuries of prairie decomposition, this soil possesses an extraordinary concentration of organic matter and water retention capabilities, consistently delivering unmatched crop yields. The fields of Iowa and Nebraska produce the foundational commodities, specifically corn and soybeans, that power the global supply chain, serving as the primary baseline inputs for global livestock feed, industrial biofuels, and consumer food manufacturing. However, the institutional investment thesis for targeting the Heartland extends far beyond traditional agricultural yields. Wall Street funds are executing an asset-stacking strategy known as the energy dual play. When a private equity firm acquires thousands of contiguous acres in states like Iowa and Nebraska, they are not just buying the rights to cultivate corn. They are strategically positioning themselves to capture highly lucrative, long-term secondary revenue streams. Because these states sit within prime wind and solar corridors, institutional owners can negotiate lucrative infrastructure easements with utility conglomerates. Corporate landlords can lease the airspace and small physical footprints of their land for wind turbines and solar arrays, collecting guaranteed, government-subsidized energy lease payments, while the tenant farmer continues to work the surrounding soil, effectively doubling the asset's economic output without increasing agricultural overhead. This institutional land grab is precisely synchronized with a looming structural crisis, the great demographic handover of American agriculture. The average age of the American farmer is now rapidly approaching 60 years old. Over the next decade, an estimated 400 million acres of domestic agricultural land are projected to change hands as an entire generation of multi-generational producers enters retirement. Because high operating costs and structural barriers prevent younger independent operators from taking over these farms, a historic liquidity vacuum has emerged across the Midwest. Deep-pocketed institutional buyers, armed with sophisticated data analytics and immediate access to global capital markets, are perfectly positioned to exploit this generational transition, stepping into the vacuum to absorb vast swathes of ancestral land. The artificial price spike, priced out of your own home state, the massive influx of corporate capital into Iowa and Nebraska has triggered an artificial price spike that is fundamentally destabilizing local real estate dynamics. Historically, local land auctions were balanced economic ecosystems where neighboring farmers competed based on localized crop pricing, realistic yield models, and community bank financing. Today, these public auctions have been utterly distorted. Institutional funds enter the bidding process with virtually limitless cash reserves and a fiduciary mandate to deploy capital as an inflation hedge. Consequently, these corporate entities routinely outbid local generational farmers by 20% to 30%, driving purchase prices completely out of line with the actual agricultural productivity of the soil and instantly resetting the tax baselines and property valuations across entire counties. This corporate-driven price inflation has resulted in the total collapse of entry-level independent farming for young or first-generation producers. The financial barriers to land ownership have become completely insurmountable. Commercial agricultural lenders require strict debt-to-equity ratios and realistic cash flow projections based on historical commodity prices. When per-acre land costs are driven to historic, artificial highs by Wall Street bidding wars, the numbers no longer balance. Independent operators cannot borrow sufficient capital to compete, nor can they generate enough revenue from crop yield alone to service the massive debt required to secure an inflated mortgage, effectively locking an entire generation out of land ownership within their own home states. The extinction of the American family farm, the structural shift from decentralized land ownership to corporate consolidation, is exacting a devastating toll on the human geography of the American Midwest, driving the systematic extinction of the traditional family farm. When a multi-generational operation is forced into liquidation because it can no longer compete with corporate economies of scale or survive the skyrocketing property taxes driven by inflated county land valuations, a profound chain of generational continuity is permanently severed. The specialized, hyperlocalized knowledge of soil composition, weather patterns, and sustainable land management that was accumulated over centuries and passed down through lineages is completely erased, replaced by standardized, algorithmically driven corporate management models. The liquidation of these family farms triggers a destructive domino effect that rapidly unravels the entire economic and social fabric of rural America. When an institutional fund acquires thousands of acres within a county, they do not patronize local businesses. Corporate land barons utilize centralized supply chains, purchasing their seed, fertilizer, and heavy equipment in bulk directly from multinational suppliers, completely bypassing local merchants. As a direct result, local agricultural equipment dealerships face bankruptcy, small-scale grain cooperatives shutter, and independent community banks lose their primary deposit base and close their doors. As the economic foundation of these towns collapses, young families flee the region in search of viable opportunities, causing rural school districts to dry up and local medical clinics to close, ultimately transforming once vibrant, self-sustaining agricultural communities into hollowed-out, automated corporate industrial zones. Beneath the structural economic data lies a profound psychological erasure. For generations of American farmers, land is not an entry on a corporate balance sheet, a line item in an investment portfolio, or a speculative asset to be traded for quarterly returns. It represents an identity, a sacred trust, and a living heritage. Watching land that their ancestors cleared by hand, bled for, and desperately sustained to the catastrophic hardships of the Great Depression, and the Dust Bowl get absorbed into a detached, soulless corporate portfolio creates a pervasive sense of despair and disenfranchisement across the Heartland. This psychological toll manifests in rising rates of financial stress and depression among remaining independent operators, who realize they are watching the systematic erasure of their culture and way of life by an invisible, algorithmic adversary. The control of the plate, the corporate accumulation of American agricultural land, is not merely an isolated crisis for rural communities. It represents a profound systemic threat to the entire domestic food supply chain. The strategic acquisition of topsoil is a foundational step toward achieving the total vertical integration of human survival. When a handful of private equity boards and institutional asset managers own the primary physical asset, the dirt itself, they gain absolute asymmetric leverage over every subsequent node in the food network. By controlling the land, these corporate cartels acquire the power to dictate exactly which hybrid crops are planted, which proprietary chemical inputs must be utilized, how the harvest is processed, and through which corporate distribution networks it must flow. This consolidation directly exposes the public to engineered market volatility. While traditional family farmers operate with a multi-decade perspective focused on long-term soil health, crop diversification, and local supply stability, institutional asset managers operate under rigid quarterly horizons designed to maximize short-term shareholder value. Corporate-driven agriculture prioritizes the cultivation of high-margin export commodities, industrial biofuels, or corporate processing inputs over localized, diverse food production. This systemic misalignment of incentives strips the agricultural system of its natural resilience, transforming food production into a highly financialized, monocultural output that is deeply vulnerable to supply shocks, directly driving up retail grocery prices for everyday consumers. The endgame, the corporate feudalism of food. If the current trajectory of institutional land accumulation across states like Iowa and Nebraska continues unhindered, the structural endgame for American agriculture points to a chilling economic paradigm, the rise of modern corporate feudalism. In this hyper-consolidated future, the historical ideal of the independent American pioneer farmer is completely eradicated. Instead, the agricultural sector will mirror a digital form of medieval sharecropping, where tech billionaires, private equity conglomerates, and sovereign wealth conduits own the physical asset of the earth in perpetuity. Proprietary corporate algorithms and satellite data networks will dictate daily farming operations, yield projections, and resource allocation from distant skyscrapers, while human beings are reduced to mere contract laborers, executing corporate commands on soil they can never afford to own. This impending reality demands a fundamental shift in how the public perceives the crisis in the Heartland. The ongoing consolidation of agricultural land is not a distant, romanticized issue confined to pastoral landscapes or rural economies. It is a cold, calculated, and high-stakes economic war, the ultimate battle for national self-reliance, economic independence, and the preservation of decentralized property ownership is not being waged on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange or in the halls of Congress. It is being fought quietly, day by day, without public fanfare, inside local Midwestern real estate offices, county deed registries, and rural courthouse auctions, where the foundational infrastructure of American survival is being permanently transferred to institutional balance sheets.